Newburyport Literary Festival. This is our 20th anniversary of the Literary Festival and our 5th anniversary of the virtual festival, which of course we started by necessity during the pandemic, but we're continuing so we can have awesome events like this with Jennifer Saint coming in from the UK and Maria Zoccola coming in from Memphis, Tennessee. But before I introduce them further, I just want to thank our sponsors, as always, our founding sponsors, the Newburyport Bank and the Institution for Savings. We couldn't do this without them, and we couldn't do it without you and your donations. So thank you so much. I also want to give a shout out to our partner bookstores. You probably know that it was Independent Bookstore Day yesterday, and we really encourage you to shop local. That's the Bookshop of Beverly Farms and Jabberwocky Bookshop. So you can find the books by our wonderful authors from the festival there. And I believe there was some 10% discount maybe floating for the weekend. Jennifer Saint grew up reading Greek mythology and was always drawn to the untold stories hidden within the myths, which is what we hope to talk about today. She read classical studies at King's College London, where she is now a visiting research fellow in the classics department. After 13 years as a high school English teacher, she wrote Ariadne, which was shortlisted for the Waterstones Book of the Year in 2021. Her second novel, Electra, and her third novel, Atlanta, were #1 Sunday Times bestsellers. Her latest mesmerizing mythological retelling is titled Hera. Maria Zoccola is a poet and educator from Memphis, Tennessee. Shout out to Memphis, where Vicki Hendrickson, the founder of this festival, is from. Her debut poetry collection, Helen of Troy, 1993, reimagines the Homeric Helen as a dissatisfied housewife living in small-town Tennessee in the early 90s and was published by Scribner in January. Her work has also appeared in The Atlantic, Plowshares, the Kenyon Review, and the Iowa Review. She has degrees from Emory University and Falmouth University and has spent many years managing programming for youth leadership and social justice nonprofits. And thank you both so much for being here. Jennifer, I'm going to start with you. Can you just give us a little bit of an introduction into how you got into writing and writing retelling myth?
Yeah, sure. Well, thank you so much for having me, first of all, and hello everyone. So how I got into writing and writing myth is the same story because I got into both at the same time. I always had a passion both for books, reading and writing them, and for Greek mythology, really for as long as I can remember. And I think that the writing part of it was one of those things that faded away for a while. I had kids, I was an English teacher, as you mentioned, and saying that I wanted to be a writer started to feel more ridiculous, just like something that could never really, really happen. And it was when I think I was 35, that I decided, well, I had the revelation, oh, if I don't write a book, then I will never have written a book, which does sound very obvious, I realize. But I just thought, yeah, the only thing that's actually stopping me from achieving this is me and my own self-doubts. So I made it a New Year's resolution. That I was going to write a novel and I was going to write just something from start to finish. I wasn't going to start and give up as I always had done in the past. So I started on the 1st of January 2019 with this New Year's resolution. And that book was Ariadne. And the reason that I decided to tell her story was because that was a story I wanted to read. Because I had my children. My oldest son was 5 years old, so I was starting to share Greek mythology with them. This kind of thing that I had always loved, these stories I'd always had a passion for. So when we were reading, as it was obviously titled Theseus and the Minotaur, it just got me thinking, what about Ariadne? Isn't her story perhaps actually the more interesting story rather than just the hero slaying the monster? What about the woman who saved the hero at the cost of betraying her entire family and her kingdom and sacrificing her own half brother, the Minotaur? So that was the story I decided to tell. And I honestly had no expectations of where that would take me. I thought maybe like my mum would read it. But as it turned out, a few more people than my mum wanted to read it in the end, and it turned out really well. It's the only New Year's resolution I have ever actually kept, I've got to say, but I kind of feel like it's a whole lifetime's worth.
Amazing. Well, we're all happy that you kept that resolution. Maria?
I just like Jennifer, I grew up reading Greek mythology. I was a total Greek myth nerd, even as a little girl, running in and out of the branches of Memphis public libraries, checking out books of Greek myth that were probably way too adult for me, but like nobody was ever watching what I was reading. By the time I got to maybe ninth grade English, I already knew all the stories, the heroes and gods and monsters and lineages. But ninth grade English was when we read the Iliad and the Odyssey for the first time. We used the Robert Fagles translation and we blew through both of them in about 6 weeks. And I just had this conviction while I was reading those epics, especially the Iliad, that I was having this experience that was going to stick with me for the rest of my life. I fell in love with the language and the characters and the way that honor and fate touched every single part of the epic. And I knew that the Iliad was becoming this kind of almost like sacred text for me in a way. Like, Alexander the Great who slept with it under his pillow every night. I kind of felt like I was following in his shoes. And when I began writing creatively in a more serious way, much of the work I was producing was influenced by or engaged with Greek mythology in various ways. There's a longer story there, but it all kind of culminated most recently in my debut poetry collection.
Wow, amazing. I also sort of started it with a Iliad obsession when I was in a production of the Iliad here in Newburyport, Massachusetts in the 80s. As a I was a nymph.
Oh, I must.
Yes,
There's
exactly.
not that many female parts available in the Iliad, really, are
Yeah,
there? So
right. Um, but that was many years ago, but really started me. And then I studied classics in college too. So I want to talk about how you find the thread to weave between the story that's already been told so many times. Where how does that story develop?
Um, yeah, so that's a really good question. And I think for me, I would always say that the kind of key question that I always start with is not really so much what happened, but why did it happen? That is the interesting part, and that is where the story really is. Because the thing about Greek mythology is that it has been told and retold for thousands of years, across the centuries, and I find that really magical in itself. And I think this is why you can come to it in your ninth grade English class, and you can feel that same magic that people felt listening to this, by firelight in an ancient world that's unrecognizable to us in so many ways, but is so deeply familiar because these stories still exist and these characters still captivate us, and we can still take lessons, some of them the same lessons and some of them new lessons from these ancient tales. And I think just the fact that myths survive and endure tells us how important they are to human beings, especially in a world like today when we feel so very polarized and so very divided. It's very easy to kind of to be in our own little bubbles and to feel like everybody else is so different and so distant from us. And this shared storytelling, I think, is something that always just brings me back to the idea these stories speak to a shared experience at the heart of humanity. And so there is value in telling them and retelling them and in reinterpreting them. And we are never going to want to do it in the same way as somebody else. And we are never going to do it in the same way as somebody else because these have come from the tradition of oral storytelling. From the very moment that these stories were being told, they were being interpreted by whoever was telling them. And, there would never be the exact same version twice. So I think that is what makes them so uniquely ripe for retelling and reimagining. And I just think it's fascinating how you can take a character like, I mean, I'm sure you're going to talk to us about Helen of Troy. So she seems like a really good example. How somebody can take Helen, and the why is really fascinating when it comes to Helen, because we can say, okay, she went to Troy, and that's the what happened to her, and then there was a war. It's delving into the but why did she go? And how did she feel about going? That is going to give you every variation of Helen as there is a storyteller to tell that story. And that's always where I begin is thinking, okay, I know the skeleton of this story. I know the bare bones of this story. And now to put flesh on those bones, I am going to figure out who was this person in my imagining of the story and what is it that drives them to act in these different ways. And that's where I'm going to find the story that I'm going to tell that somebody else hasn't told before and that is worth telling now.
Yeah, I think just like Jennifer said, these stories have been told and retold for generations. And I think there's something incredibly freeing about that. We can all have our own versions of these stories because we're not writing the final version. Next year, there will be another Helen of Troy book. The year after that, there will be another Helen of Troy book. My grandchildren will be reading Helen of Troy books. We can even think of the written version of the Iliad as it comes to us in Homer as a type of retelling, the setting down into words of this epic that has been in existence in oral tradition since before whoever the person named Homer picked up a pen and wrote it down. Um, I kind of think of it as threads in a tapestry or beads on a string, that there are so many beads between me and Homer, and I'm not the final bead on the line. And then, like Jennifer said, finding the kind of hidden threads in these stories, the ways to put our own spin on them. For Helen of Troy, for example, in mythology and in retellings, she's almost more of an idea than a person, kind of a ghost or a paper doll that we can put our own interpretations on. Because if we look at her appearances in the Iliad, she's only present in 6 scenes in the original Homer. She doesn't have so much real estate to tell us who she is, what her opinions are, what the real story is from her perspective. We don't understand Helen from Helen. We understand Helen from the other characters around her, the other writers writing at the time, and the interpretations of Helen down those beads on the string. So when I kind of dream a new version of Helen in poetry, I'm one more bead on the string, one more person figuring out who this paper doll is, and hopefully doing a good job. But even if somebody reads this book and decides this is not Helen, well, next year there will be another one. Hopefully they'll write their own the year after that.
That's a great answer. I love that. A couple things there, but that it's always been retold. The myths have always been retold. We're in a new era of retelling them, but they are meant to be retold as they are oral traditions, as you pointed out. So you mentioned, you talked about the 6 scenes that Helen is in and all the different um, beads or other interpretations that we have. But when you are writing these, how do you dress the paper doll? How do you use the research, the myth, the body of work that already exists to create the characters that you are creating? So you're obviously using your imagination, but you're using how much research are you going back to the myth? What's the evolution there?
Yeah, definitely going back to the original Homer. I'm like a collector of translations of Homer, so I have a huge
Me
stack of
too.
all the
Me too.
various ones.
Loving the Emily Wilson.
Yes, love the Emily Wilson one. Love the Fagles. I mean, I even love kind of the old versions, the really like archaic language, sing-songy. I mean, I just think they're all really beautiful the way that they approach it. Other Greek writers like Euripides, and then of course the body of scholarship that has been done on the Iliad for literally generations. I mean, I also studied classics in college, and the beautiful thing about studying classics is that there's never an end point. There are always new journals to check out, new writers writing new pieces of work on these myths that have been around for thousands of years. So There is a point, though, that I think the research has to stop and you have to let your own imagination and your own kind of writer spirit take over. Who was the writer that said that poetry can be negatively impacted by research? And I think that that is definitely true. There is a point where you do have to kind of put the books down and just open up the blank notebook page.
Yeah, and I think in the editing process, that's quite often when some of that research gets stripped away. I think I find, I kind of put in things because I've read them, and so I want them to go in the book. And actually, it's when I come to edit and to redraft that I think, no, that's only there because I'm showing off that I've read this particular book. It's not contributing to the story. Um, but you kind of, I think, as much of it as you take out, it's really important to do it all because that adds the texture and the layers to your imagining of that worldview. So yeah, so like Maria, I will always go back to the ancient text, to the playwrights, the tragedians, Euripides, Sophocles, Aeschylus, and obviously Homer, Hesiod. I read a lot of Ovid, the Metamorphoses, especially for Hera, which is a story, my first story about a goddess. So the Metamorphoses is a rich text in terms of all of the bad behavior of the Olympian gods in all of its numerous and varied forms. But as well as reading, then I think artwork is so important as well. I love to go back to vase paintings. I was in Paris a couple of years ago and I went to the Louvre, and obviously the Louvre is so crowded and hot and busy. But there is, if you ever go to Paris, a glorious oasis in the form of the Greek Vases Gallery where nobody seems to go. It's just past the Winged Victory. You will have it all to yourself. It's very nice and cool and calm. And it's just full of these vases depicted with mythological scenes. And I think there is so much that you can get from a visual. So in terms of finding the character of Hera that I wanted to portray, because Hera is in so many of the texts that I'm reading, actually filtering out, finding that point to stop doing the research, like you say, Maria, was really difficult because you could read forever about Hera. She is in everything, usually is this very malevolent presence. And always they're kind of sulking and vindictive, and she's Zeus's jealous wife, and she is in this very domestic sphere all the time. We see her defined by her marriage, and in fact she is the goddess of marriage, so the whole institution kind of entraps her, and we see her as this very like bitter, joyless woman. um but my favorite vase painting of Hera actually shows her in the Gigantomachy, in the battle of the gods against the giants. And she is looking so regal on this vase painting and wearing a beautiful long dress, but she is holding a gigantic spear, and there is a giant falling backwards in front of her, and she is about to deliver the killing blow. And that was how I opened the book. I opened the book with that scene, this moment of Hera the warrior, Hera in battle, not Hera, this miserable, restricted, constrained wife, but this other version of Hera who I feel that a lot of people have never got to see, because the people who've been interested in telling the stories a lot of the times have had more of an interest in showing us, look at Hera spoiling all of Zeus's fun. So I wanted to show like Hera's this wild, free, ferocious woman who you are going to meet a different version of her when you read my book to perhaps the one you've met before.
I love that you're going to that source material, which is arts, not just the epics. Heidi in the comments mentioned that she'd love to see that. Can you say the name of the vase again? Do you think that maybe it's in the collection online or anything? Do you know? Probably not.
Um, I've definitely put it on my Instagram before. So but I would say that if you Google Hera vase painting giants, you will probably find it.
And Louvre, maybe.
Yeah.
But that is, thank you, Heidi, for asking a question. I will let everyone know then. If you have questions, we're going to be turning to that in a little while. So think of those and please put them in the chat. I don't think it's really possible to talk about myth without talking about the patriarchy a bit and how all of these myths are so patriarchal and have such, you know, the strong male character, and then like you're saying, the bitter wife or the almost invisible Helen other than, the face that launched 1,000 ships. Um, how do you deal with that in the text?
Oh, how do you deal with patriarchy, Maria? On this one, there's so many answers.
It's true. I think so when let's start the story a little bit further back. At the start of the pandemic, I started a poetry project writing persona poems in the voices of women from the Iliad. If you're not a poetry person, that's okay. A persona poem is a poem in which the I of the poem, I am, I did, is not the poet herself, but as a character the poet is writing through. So I was writing these poems in the voices of Iphigenia and Clytemnestra and Hecuba. But I didn't write a poem in the voice of Helen because the truth was at that time I didn't like Helen very much. I found her to be this deeply unsympathetic character. She starts her life as princess of Sparta. She becomes queen of Sparta when she marries Menelaus. The Trojan prince Paris comes to Sparta and scoops her away to Troy. Perhaps it was a kidnapping, perhaps they ran away together. She becomes princess of Troy. And at the end of the Trojan War, as Troy falls, Menelaus scoops her out of Troy, takes her back to Sparta, and reinstalls her as queen of Sparta. So she goes from princess to princess to queen again. And I always contrasted that with the fate of all of the other female characters around her who fairly universally in the Iliad end their stories either slain or enslaved. In comparison, Helen's super kind of cushy ride through the story was not a very satisfying narrative arc to me. So I kind of left Helen alone for a while. And then about a year later, I moved from Georgia back to Tennessee. I bought a house, I got a new job, and kind of out of nowhere, I dove for my notebook and wrote 7 Helen poems in a row. And the voice that emerged had nothing to do with Bronze Age Greece or a war between city-states. It felt really fresh and modern. It felt like I was writing into my own childhood in 1990s Tennessee. And I knew I had to just keep writing until the book project was finished. And the process of writing that book was transformational to my own relationship with Helen as a character and sitting with her appearances in the Iliad, in scholarship around Helen, in my own interpretation of Helen in my book. I began to understand that far from being this fallen woman at fault for the war that ends the Age of Heroes in Greece, Helen was a woman without choices throughout the Iliad. She's treated as an object throughout the story. She is told to marry Menelaus. She's given to Paris by the goddess Aphrodite as a reward for naming Aphrodite first in a beauty contest among immortals. She's taken by Paris to Troy and then taken by Menelaus back to Sparta. She's a woman without agency. I began to understand that Helen was just as much under the control of fate, the gods, and the men around her as the other women in the story, the women that I initially found so much more sympathetic than Helen. I really began to see Helen in a completely new light, and she's my best friend now.
And, and I think so similarly, with Hera, I felt like she is the goddess who really everybody hates. And, she would always have been my least favorite of the Olympian goddesses if I was ranking them in order. And for very similar reasons, to what you say about Helen. And I think those two characters have something in common with one another, and that is that they are consummate survivors. And sometimes that means that they are working in concert with the patriarchy in order to achieve their own ends. As much as they might underneath bitterly rail against it, these are two women who do what they need to do in order to survive in a world that is so brutal, particularly in its treatment of them and the women around them. So Hera was definitely, she wasn't kind of an obvious feminist icon. She is not part of the sisterhood in any way. If anything, the stories that we hear most frequently about Hera are about how she punishes other women for being preyed upon by her husband. That's what we hear over and over again. And so I did kind of think in writing this book, well, how on earth am I going to write about a woman who seems to act for the patriarchy? How am I going to make her a protagonist that even I want to delve into? And it was these other elements of Hera, like I mentioned, it was Hera in battle. It was Hera when I began to think about what she might represent as a real figure in the ancient world, as a real goddess, in terms of she was actually worshipped. You know, she was the goddess of wives. And I wondered, well, what might Hera mean to the women who worship her? Not just as an object of fear, because so many of the stories about her teach us to be afraid of her, you know, afraid of her vengeance. Um, what could she offer these women that would make them actually want to worship her? And I thought about how these women, they also had no choice over who their husband was. Just like Hera did not choose to marry Zeus, who was, I am very sorry to say, if anybody didn't know, her brother, which is quite an upsetting fact. You know, she didn't choose to marry Zeus, she was forced into that marriage. She's made this emblem of wives, and her husband flouts the whole institution of marriage at every possible opportunity. He is a philanderer. When we see them together in the Iliad, I think it gives us a great insight into their relationship. We see how Zeus humiliates Hera in front of the other gods. He gives her orders, he threatens her with violence. We can see how her anger and her resentment builds and builds against Zeus. And if we're talking about the patriarchy is Zeus. They are one and the same, they are intertwined. Um, but she cannot strike out directly against him most of the time. But in the Iliad, we see how she still connives against him. You know, we see Hera riding into battle at the side of Athena. We see her manipulating Zeus. We see how she wants to rebel against him and how she will do whatever she can in order to, like Helen, keep surviving and keep succeeding. And I thought that was a really fascinating way to look at somebody whose choices are shaped by the world that is around her, by this deeply patriarchal world. Um, but to stop pitting Hera against other women, because I think that's something that the patriarchy does to us all the time. Kind of, it wants to isolate women and it wants to tell us, you know, well, there's Helen, like she's so beautiful, let's all hate her. And it wants to tell you, here's Hera, she's so bitter, let's all be afraid of her. And actually, when we humanize these women and when we look at them in context and when we think about their lives and the choices that they make, then we see so much more to them than just agents of the patriarchy. And that was, you know, that was a more challenging, she was a more challenging character for me to take on. But I felt like that was something that is really, really worth exploring.
Yeah, amazing. I really love that that just adding more layers to these characters that were never really fully developed because we had to, tell another hero story as
Hmm.
opposed to the story of any of the women. I do feel, I mean, it's no surprise that these are super violent myths. I mean, there's off rape and pillage and women being lives destroyed on the reg. Um, is that disturbing in your writing, and how do you deal with that? Is there any self-care rituals you do to help combat that?
I mean, I don't know about you, Maria, but I think writing is an act of self-care in itself. You know, I think that delving into these stories, yes, sometimes it takes you to some very dark places, but I think the difference is that as the writer, you are in control of that, and actually getting to tell the story feels like an act of healing in itself, I always think. When I wrote my second novel, Electra, one of the narrators of that novel is Clytemnestra, Helen's twin sister, mother of Iphigenia, and obviously Electra as well. And what happens to Clytemnestra is every mother's worst nightmare. She loses her child under unimaginable circumstances. And writing that scene was one of the most painful things that I have ever written. But I think that in writing, that courage to go to those places and to explore the kind of limits of the human experience and the human imagination, that that is, I think that is something that emboldens you, and I think it's something that strengthens you. And I think that to create that as a story and to share it with other people and to have their reactions whenever anybody reads that particular scene in Electra, if any of my friends, I know when they've got to the end of chapter 9, they will always text me. um, and I think when we share those stories, then we find that connection with each other and that kind of solidarity with each other, and that is strengthening, and that is self-care. We can't really shy away from these things. There's no value in turning a blind eye and pretending that it doesn't happen. That's part of the reason for stories to exist, I think, to take us to these different places, and some of them are very dark and frightening, um but to bring us back safely. What do you think, Maria?
Well, I think that's definitely true. And I think that the violence of the original mythology, especially the violence directed towards women, is often the jumping off point for folks, especially women who are retelling these myths. That's why we want to retell them. We want to say, oh, okay, well, when Ariadne was abandoned on that island, what was she feeling in that moment? Or when Clytemnestra lost Iphigenia, what was she feeling in that moment? What was the aftermath of that like? Because the myth ends there. It follows another character after that. It goes sailing off with Theseus, not with Ariadne. It doesn't stay on that island. So our retellings get to stay on that island. Our retellings get to sit with Clytemnestra in that horrific moment. We get to sit with Helen behind the walls of Troy, or before that in Sparta. We don't get in the original mythology what Helen was feeling in Sparta before Paris even showed up, but in our retellings, we get to have those moments.
Yeah, and it
I
is so cool.
I love that they're sort of sitting with them, and having that moment, and you get to create that moment for yourselves, and then we get to enjoy it. So that's amazing. Maria, I want to ask you a specific question about the timing of your poetry collection. You brought Helen into not quite contemporary times, but modern times. Can you talk about that decision?
Yeah, definitely. So the poetry collection is called Helen of Troy 1993. Much of the action occurs in the year 1993, but the poetry collection also follows Helen's birth, childhood, coming of age, marriage, journey into motherhood. So part of the books takes place as well in the 70s and 80s and early 90s, kind of before we hit 1993. I knew as I was first beginning to write this collection that I was writing into my own childhood in the early 90s. That was part of what was so chewy about the retelling to me, that I got to bring it into not quite contemporary times, but modern times. But I knew also as I was writing it that I would have to do pretty significant research for it. I had a ton of memories from the early 90s, but they're child's memories. They're not what it would mean to be an adult in that time period. And I was not alive in the 70s and 80s. So I got to do all this really amazing research, like looking at digitized LL Bean catalogs from the era, or watching on YouTube people's uploaded their home movies of their children's Chuck E. Cheese birthday parties, from 1992, or looking at crop reports from the early 90s, or rewatching the 1993 classic Jurassic Park to get all the details right for a poem. So getting to blend these really exciting, like kind of recent history with ancient history was really cool to me. I had a lot of fun with it.
I would
Wow.
love
Yeah.
that research.
Um, and then Jennifer, we talked a little bit about Ariadne and Hera, but let's talk about your third book, your middle book,
Yeah,
and why you
Atalanta.
chose. Yeah, and why you chose that character to retell.
Yes, of course. Yeah. So Atalanta was so interesting to me because, we've talked about following the heroes. And with Atalanta, she is somebody who, I mean, at least we've heard of Ariadne, most of us, but Atalanta, I just felt had actually been written out of the story entirely. She was the only female Argonaut. She was the only woman on board the Argo with Jason and the rest of them. And that in itself already you just think, well, I definitely want to know more about this woman's life. And it only just that was like one of actually the least interesting things about Atalanta, because as I looked into her more, it only got better and better. I think my this kind of deciding factor in, yes, I have to write this novel, I have to write about this woman, was actually the story of Atalanta's birth. Um, which begins, she is abandoned on a hillside to die, as we know happened to female babies sometimes. She's left there on in the forest because she has not been born a son. But she doesn't die. She's rescued by a mother bear, and she is suckled by the mother bear. And I had this image of a baby girl who grows strong drinking bear milk, of this little infant child who plays rough and tumble with her little bear cub siblings. And I thought, what kind of a woman does she become? I mean, definitely the kind of woman who goes and joins a hero's journey, who's determined to go and carve out her own path and leave her own name um, in the, in like the annals of history. I felt like this is what Jason wants. This is what Theseus wants. They want to seek this immortality and this glory of having their name remembered. And that's why it doesn't matter who else pays the price. It's worth it if they can be remembered. And I really wanted to write about a woman who felt the same and whose name for so many people was not remembered, because actually they did succeed in wiping her out of that story. Um, there's a particular, I think I quite often get the inspiration for writing from feeling really annoyed by something. And I was particularly annoyed in the Argonautica, which is our only sort of complete surviving ancient version of the story of the Argonauts. That's kind of the whole thing start to finish, and that's kind of the seminal text that you would go back to for the legend of the Argonauts. And Atalanta has a cameo in that. She shows up and she says, I want to come on board, I want to join. And Jason won't let her. He says, no, but I will take your spear with me. So he takes her spear, which I think she's going to need, by the way. She's a huntress. And that's like that. And so she's represented on the voyage, but she's not actually there. And I really, really took great umbrage at Apollonius of Rhodes for writing this scene and for not giving us the story of Atalanta actually being like a complete badass amongst the rest of them. It makes for a better story. And so I thought, right, okay, well, that's a story that I'm going to write then. And it was so much fun. I absolutely love that novel and I loved the writing of it.
Amazing. I often wonder, why do we always have to focus on the men's stories? I mean, of course, as a woman, I feel like women's stories are interesting, but these are all interesting stories. Who cares? Not who cares, but like, why another hero's journey? As I said before, well,
Oh,
another.
they were interesting in the ancient world as well, because we have plays by Euripides, like we have Medea. It's like it's called the play is about her. It's not about
Yeah,
Jason.
absolutely.
You have Amazons all over vase paintings all the time. Clytemnestra is a really popular subject in ancient art. They were interested in the women's stories at the time, but somewhere in history somebody was making a conscious decision not to give us those stories, but to focus on the man.
Not cool.
No.
Are you ever tempted to change the endings?
Yes. um, and I do. So when it came to writing Hera, I guess there was no ending. There was no obvious ending to her story, and that made me think I have got to create my own ending for Hera's story. She's an immortal goddess, so like where do you draw the line? And actually, that was one of the things that made her so interesting to me, because the Greek gods are not worshipped anymore, obviously. They did come to an end, and so in thinking of how to bring Hera's story to an end, I was particularly interested in the idea of what does happen to gods? Why do religions fall? And what did we need them for, and what do we replace them with? And that kind of I found that a really liberating idea, and it definitely made me think for future novels about the different ways that we can write endings. I think that there's definitely for me been kind of an evolution through these stories that I'm telling. So when kind of I started out with Ariadne, I felt like I was in direct conversation with the stories about Ariadne that I'd read before, and preserving Ariadne's ending was really important to me because I wanted to say something about what happened to that woman.
Mm. Mm.
But as I've kind of kept on writing and kept on immersing myself in the mythology and exploring it, um, I have thought more about the option of rewriting and changing and not just telling my reinterpretation of the story, but maybe telling the version that I wish had been told instead. So definitely for kind of future stories that I'm telling, I have opened myself up to the idea of playing with the ending, um, to kind of keep developing the different things that I want to say about these women about their lives.
Amazing. Maria, I wanted to ask you a little bit about how you developed Helen in the modern way, and if there were constraints that you felt, or you felt of real freedom, or how did that development happen for you?
Yeah, I think one of the most beautiful things about a poetry collection is that although you can treat it as having a narrative arc, because each poem stands on its own, you can focus on the most interesting parts of that narrative arc. You don't always have to think, how do I get for a character from A to B? You can just write a poem at A and then next write a poem at B, and then the reader can do their own work to get from A to B. So that allowed me to be able to pick the most interesting parts of the Helen of Troy mythology and to add my own stuff in there. So I got to think about to go back to that previous question about endings and the container, the mythological container that a character is inside. You know, what parts of that container do I want to address, and what parts do I want to leave out? I've been getting that question a lot on book tour, folks asking, okay, but why at the end of your book does she go back to Sparta, to go back to Menelaus, go back to her former life? Why doesn't she, leave Paris and go off on a road trip to find herself or move to Hollywood and become an actress? Why did you place her back into Sparta? And I've been thinking very deeply about that question, about this question of endings, character development, how much of these characters belong to us, how much of them belong to this larger umbrella that we can't adjust and change. I've been thinking about to go back to even our question about the patriarchy, is the container, the mythological container, a form of violence enacted against these female characters? And are we able to change it in retellings, or are we frozen inside that original container by keeping the shape of that container? Am I, as an author, continuing to enact violence against Helen as a character by sending her back to her former life into a world that hasn't really changed since she left it to go to Troy? Am I ultimately, no different from the folks who created that original container? Lots to think about.
Yeah, that's an interesting idea. And also, I appreciate your concern for Helen, and ongoing concern that you might be keeping her in that container. um, have there been any surprises for you all as you've gone through things that you didn't expect about a character, about the development of these pieces of your work?
Mm.
Yeah, I mean, I think that I am continually surprised when writing. I don't know how much I don't know if it's maybe different with poetry or just everybody has a different process anyway. I wonder, Maria, how much you plan in advance because I always have a plan. I always have an outline of a novel. And I would say that I always get to where I intended to go. I always know the ending and I always get there. But the route that I take to get there, that is the thing that changes. And that's where the surprises happen along the way. Because you just find out that actually this character, as you get to know them as a writer, they just don't do all the things that you thought they were going to do. And some of those decisions that I've made in the planning, it just doesn't work when it comes to it. And these women are saying to me, no, I don't think I would behave like that, actually. You're gonna have to find another way out of this this plot dilemma that you've got yourself into. I mean, what's that like in poetry?
Yeah, I think slightly less of characters taking the wheel and driving the bus themselves. But it has been interesting to think I know what the shape of the book is going to look like, and then realize that the shape that I ended up with looks very different from the
Mhm.
one that I thought it was going to be. A major question I had when writing this book is what to do with the Trojan War itself. That is the reason why Helen's name is so present to us in the year 2025 out of 3,000 years ago, because she is the casus belli of the Trojan War. But the Trojan War itself has so little to do with Helen. That is kings and heroes and bloodshed and horses and chariots and the plains of Troy, and so little to do with Helen behind the walls of Troy. In the end, after, going back and forth on what to do with this gigantic war in this book, I reduced it to a single poem in the entire collection, which surprised me when I had kind of finished the book and said, wait a minute, I think I only have one poem that's about the war itself, and decided that was actually perfect. That was exactly what I wanted to do with the war.
Yeah, great. Also want to ask this question, one more question, and then I'm going to take questions from the audience. So please put those in the Q&A. Just about your writing process. How does that go for you? What's your daily life like in terms of how you make your art?
I mean, so for me, writing is my full-time job. So
Lucky.
it it is yeah, it's extremely fortunate. And so my writing process, I think, looks really different now. When I was writing Ariadne, I was working as an English teacher. My youngest child was a very bad sleeper. So I wrote so much of Ariadne sitting on the carpet in the hallway outside his bedroom, waiting for him to go to sleep. So much of that book. But now, I think I've become so like privileged and cosseted, like now that I'm a writer, now I can have like a completely different process. So I work in the room where I'm sitting now. I have an actual room, not just the hallway. I cleared out the guest room and like made it into my office. And yeah, so I work, I sit down and I write in working hours. Like I treat it like a job. I'm not somebody, because it is my job, I'm not somebody who can go out and kind of like write in cafes or anything like that. I can't deal with distraction. That door behind me has to be closed and it has to stay closed. Otherwise I will be in all sorts of places and not in the story where I need to be. But I do think you can, I come home from dropping my kids off at school and I sit down, and a lot of the time the words don't come. I think that is such a part of writing. And I've learned that you have to push through that. Sometimes the right thing to do is to go for a walk. Sometimes I find swimming is quite often when my brain is actually, unbeknownst to me, ticking over the story, and I will get out of the pool and suddenly like I know the answer to something that has been keeping me frozen, and I can't write it down because I'm all wet and I have to dictate it into my phone. And it's very stressful. But yeah, so sometimes I think like kind of movement and definitely getting out in nature is the key to like unscrambling a stuck brain. But sometimes it is just simply sitting there and writing with the knowledge that the best writing is always the rewriting anyway. And there is nothing worse than the blank page. And so long as words go on that page, in the end, it will be a book. And I think when you sit down at the start, it feels impossible to imagine. I know I've done it before, but surely this time I cannot get a book to fruition. But I have learned that books are made sentence by sentence and word by word, and you just have to keep going.
Lovely. Maria?
I think the difference between a poetry collection and a novel is that when you have a problem in a poem, you have a problem in 200 words. You have 200 words to untangle. When you have a problem in a novel, you have 100,000 words to untangle. So you have many small victories and many small problems. You have multiple milestones. This book has 50 poems in it, which means I had 50 stopping points throughout the book. I could finish a piece and say, okay, this piece is finished on top of the stack,
Mhm.
on to the next piece. I got to start fresh so very often, which is really, really beautiful. And I have really intense ADHD, and that helps my brain so much to say, okay, one piece is finished and I get to start completely fresh on the next page. Some poems took, a couple of days to write, even a couple of weeks to write, and some poems arrived on the page almost entirely fully formed. It's funny how knowing how to write one poem does not mean you know how to write any other poems. You know how to write that poem. I've heard novelists say that as well, that when you write a book, well, now you know how to write that book, but you have no idea how to write the next book. Do you feel that way, Jennifer?
Yes, absolutely. That is completely the case. It seems impossible every time. And I know, and one of my friends says that she's every time she starts, she Googles how to write a book. And sometimes her own articles come up that she's written advising people how to write a book. We all start completely baffled, but we get there.
Um, so I want to take a few questions from our Q&A. This is actually something that I've been thinking about too from one of our steering committee members, Betsy Westendorf, and we talked about it in our pre-call, but it this conversation really aligns with the Dawn Tripp, a conversation we had with Dawn Tripp in the festival Friday night. She wrote a book called Jackie, which is a first-person account of Jackie Kennedy Onassis, and she used a lot of research to recreate that and give her three dimensions when we don't always see that in the myth that's created around Camelot. So Betsy wants to know what has been the reaction toward your work as this very important voice in the world today.
So what has been the reaction to our work? Um,
And she's giving you a compliment, saying that this is a very important voice to be represented.
right. Yeah, well, thank you. Um, so um I think it's really difficult to kind of engage with the idea of what has the reaction been to my work, because I think you kind of have to cut yourself off from that to some extent as a writer. Um, like I would never read reviews. I mean, I learned that the hard way.
Oh no.
Like most people do. Um, the very, very first review for Ariadne that I ever read, this was pre-publication. It was an American trade magazine who reviewed it, and they eviscerated it. And it was so painful. I found it by Googling myself, so good lesson not to do that. I think my publishers are kind of like not going to tell me to protect me from it. And it was like the first reaction that I had read to my work. And I took it so hard that I started therapy the week after, um, because I
Oh.
that made me realize, oh, there is going to be a reaction to my work, and I don't think I'm prepared for it. And I think even the great reviews, sometimes it's just hard to make that it's hard to keep enough distance, I think, because even the good reviews, I don't really want them in my head when I'm writing, because I don't want to be thinking, how are people going to respond to this? Because that inhibits me creatively if I'm kind of thinking, how is somebody going to read it? Um, that kind of relationship with the reader comes later, and when I'm writing, it needs to be between me and the story, I think. Um, but I think where the reaction is so helpful and so rewarding and so sustaining is being out on tour, and meeting readers, and it's hearing people's personal connections with the stories. I think if somebody comes and tells me, like, uh, this book got me through a really hard time, or like I read this book when I was recovering from an illness and you kept me company, or somebody will say like that their dad hadn't had like never read a book and then picked up one of mine, and like now it's ignited a love of reading. And you get these kind of all of these personal stories of how your books have connected with people and inspired people. And there's really nothing more precious than that, I think, because I'm somebody who I have always loved reading. And I think of all the books in my life that have made me really feel something and that have got me through difficulties and that have been my companion, and that have inspired me to do what I do. And the idea that my work could do that for somebody else is really incredible. So I think it's the reaction on that like very personal, intimate level is it's like it's beyond words. Like that to me is just the most magical and unexpected thing that I could have.
Mhm. I agree for sure. I had an old high school teacher tell me that if you believe your compliments, you also have to believe your critics. So if
Mhm.
you just ignore both of them, then you can focus on the work that you are doing. And I think that's been really helpful for me. I'm also a person who I don't even if someone is complimenting my work, I can't even hear it. There's like a
Yeah.
blank space where they're just their mouth is moving and like nothing is actually entering my head. So that's helpful. I can tune out both of them and just focus on the work that I am doing. One of the most beautiful things has been when folks tell me that, they don't really read a lot of poetry or they don't really understand poetry or they're just not really a poetry person, but they enjoyed this book, that this book is like a pathway into poetry for folks, that they feel confident now to pick up other poetry collections, that the blend of mythology and poetry has opened up a new genre for them. That's been really, really lovely. And it's also been wonderful to talk to other like Greek myth nerds or like classics lovers. I got to, I think a couple of months ago, I was at Sewanee, the University of the South, and had this fantastic like moderated conversation with Dr. Stephanie McCarter, who recently translated Ovid's Metamorphoses. And it was this glorious like classics focus, like really like meaty and chewy conversation about retellings and myth and scholarship. And that just made my heart sing to get to have those kinds of conversations because of the work that I produced.
Oh, amazing. When you all were talking about reading reviews or not reading reviews, was reminded of something else Dawn Tripp said, actually at the after party, where about the difference between being a writer and being an author. And when you're a writer, you're working for yourself, you're doing your writing, you're in the zone, hopefully, or maybe you're not, but you're trying to get there. And you write the book, hopefully, and it gets out there. And when it's out in the world, now you're an author and your baby or your book lives in its own world and you don't have it in your world anymore and you're an author of it, but it is out there and other people interact with it and you have to, you know, deal with that in whatever way you do, which is maybe by not listening to them at all.
Yeah, I just kind of have to let it go, and it belongs to somebody else then.
Yeah,
When they read it, it's theirs.
right, right. So we have a question from Laura, who thanks you for this lovely seminar. And for Jennifer, she is saying that she really thinks of Titian's paintings when she was reading Ariadne and some of your other work. And you mentioned the vase. Um, and so she was wondering if there are any other kinds of art that you'd mentioned that was that are influences on your book.
Yes, yeah. So I will also go and look at lots of paintings, as you mentioned, Titian among them, because mythology has inspired so many different artworks, and you can. I think yeah, what I found with Ariadne that I found really captivating, really like fascinating to me, was that so many paintings depict her sleeping. Um, we see her so often in art as this very passive pose. She's asleep, she doesn't yet know that she's been betrayed. And that to me, I just, I so wanted to go and wake her up. And that, so those paintings definitely, they can sometimes like make me ask a question, or they might make me think of this character in a particular way. I think, okay, people have perceived this woman as being passive, inert, and sort of without agency. So now I'm going to do something completely different. And also, the paintings are really beautiful and inspirational as well. And I love to bring in kind of the colors and the textures. So I will quite often have little references somebody will be wearing. And Helen, for example, actually, there's a pair of paintings, one of Helen and one of Cassandra, and I used both of them when I was writing Electra. And in Helen's, she's like got this beautiful pink dress and she's holding a mirror, and it's very much kind of about vanity. And I put the mirror into the book in a scene with Helen, but I was kind of trying to approach her from a very different angle to the way that the artist had done in that case.
And this one's for you, Maria, also from Laura. Are there any other women in mythology that you'll be exploring for a future project? And would you stick to the same sort of modern times, or delve into ancient times for a different character at some point?
Mm. Prior to writing this book, I have written quite a bit of poetry with other Greek mythology characters set in ancient times. This has been my first time to break free of that and try something set in recent history. And I really loved this process. So I'd like to try that again, to bring ancient characters into the modern world. I'd really, at some point in the future, I'd love to do a project with Iphigenia. She's fascinating to me. The kind of alternate ending where she's kind of taken off the altar by Artemis and like joins the wild hunt forever, like as a handmaiden to Artemis. I love that. I'd love to do something with that.
Oh,
That sounds
amazing.
amazing. Please do that.
Um, Jennifer, I want to ask you about your future plans and some recent announcements. Before I do that, one more question from me, which is, are these ladies living in your minds now forever? Do you carry them with you as you go forward, and basically they're part of your psyche now? Or are you, able to sort of leave them and come back to them and visit as we do with friends or loved ones?
Oh yeah, they're all with me all the time. If I so like I go to Greece whenever I can, and when I am there, if I'm like at the in Athens at the Acropolis or in any museum and I'm seeing statues or paintings of them, I greet them like old friends, like hello, here you are. So nice to see you again. Yeah, I will always think of them all the time.
Oh, I love that. I do the same thing. I guess because I've loved these characters for so long that if I'm in a museum, like I was at the Carlos Museum in Atlanta in January and, hung out in the vase painting room and just like, it felt like hanging out with my friends. Like, oh yeah, there's Cassandra. Hey girl.
We'll have a little tea party.
Have a little tea party. I also feel like I'm kind of part of this club or like secret society now of people who have retold ancient stories in poetry or fiction or like folks who have lived with these characters for so long that we've created new versions of them. So I kind of feel like Jennifer, you and I are cousins now. I feel like Ann Carson and I are cousins now, part of the same club.
Yeah,
Right,
and
amazing.
these are the best people to hang out with.
Um, so to wrap us up, I'd love to hear what your next projects are, and I'll start with you, Jennifer, because you had some pretty big announcements this week.
So it's so exciting to be able to talk about it, because I have written my fifth book and I have known about this for the past year, but I haven't been able to talk about it until this Friday. So you are all
We're
like
so lucky.
unbridled enthusiasm to finally be able to say that my next novel is a romance. It's the first romance I have written, and it is the very tumultuous romance between Aphrodite, the goddess of love, and Ares, the god of war. It has been incredible to write. To write, it has been such a wild ride. And it is called This Immortal Heart, and it will be out next May.
Amazing. Congratulations. And Maria, do you have things on the docket that are coming up?
Things on the docket. I can't say too much about them right now,
Okay,
but
fair enough.
I am
You're in the position that Jennifer has been in this for the last year.
I can say I'm pivoting to a novel, which feels like coming home to me. All my degrees are writing degrees in fiction, so I feel like I get to kind of return to fiction for a novel, and I'm excited to see where that's taking me.
Amazing.
Um,
Well, I want to thank you both so much for being here. I thought this was a great conversation. And thank you for your contributions to the literary world. Beautiful work. And we really appreciate it and appreciate you being here.
well, thank you so much for having me. I had such a great conversation. It was so nice to meet you both, and thank you everybody for tuning in.
Yeah.
This was absolutely fantastic. I wish I were at the festival in person this weekend. Um, the lineup is so stacked. I just want to hang out in the room with all the writers.
Yeah, we've had a great weekend. Again, thank you, Jennifer and Maria. And thank you, everyone who joined us. Have a great afternoon.